We hit the tipping point.
Okay. I want to understand something, Representative Becerra, on this issue of the Barney Frank bill now before Congress when it comes to reforming the TARP, and the letter yesterday from the man who will be the head of the National Economic Council, Larry Summers. Is the administration and the Democrats in Congress, are they aligned on how TARP should be reformed, or are there two competing ideas, one from Congress and one from the administration?
I think there's a very clear, consistent message coming from the Obama future administration and from this Congress. We must have accountability. The way Secretary Paulson has administered the TARP money, some $300 billion plus, and the way that there was a lack of available means to try to provide that oversight will not be the course of action in the future. Both the Obama administration to come and this Congress are determined to make sure we make the changes we need to in any subsequent TARP funding to make sure that accountability is provided for. But we shouldn't tag President-elect Obama with the sins and the ills of previous administrations. Barack Obama had nothing to do with how Henry Paulson administered the TARP funding.
Congresswoman Blackburn, I know you want to make a comment on the numbers themselves, but also, could you address the issue of whether or not the revisions that Mr. Summers put in his letter and suggests should be put into the new TARP plan, whether or not they will be ultimately too punitive and keep financial institutions from applying for TARP, if indeed you cap not only compensation, but also the ability of banks to pay dividends to shareholders?
And make them retroactive.
Right. And I think what we have to do is go back and look at how much money has been spent. When you look at the 323 that was spent prior to September, when TARP was put in place, and we have spent 350 of that, you're talking about nearly $700 billion that is out the door. That's Plan A. Plan B that Obama is asking for is enormous. It is bigger than the $700 billion. We're hearing numbers over $1 trillion. So maybe that doesn't even leave room for a Plan C. Now, to come back and say, no, I'm not mixing apples and oranges. It is taxpayer money.
Hold on. When we talk about the TARP that was allocated, it's some 323 or most of the 350 on the one hand. I'm just a little lost as to how you're talking about an additional 350 already having been allocated from the TARP. It hasn't been.
No, I'm talking about what was spent. When you go back to March and you look at Bear and Fannie and Freddie and Indy and AIG, and then you come into the TARP funds.
That's technically separate from the TARP funds.
But it's all part of the debt.
Obviously,
it is all part of the spending.
Money that's being committed.
And that's right.
Congressman Becerra, there is a lot of controversy right now over whether or not making the new requirements on the TARP retroactive will in essence keep institutions from either going into the TARP if they need help, or as Chairman Barney Frank told us on Power Lunch last week, they can give the money back, certainly, but then they're not covered under the TARP. Are these new requirements too punitive, in your opinion?
If you're asking me, I'd say, look, if the banks are asking for this money, then they have to prove that they've spent it wisely. It's not their money. It's not, nor is it our money. It's the taxpayers' money. And the taxpayers are entitled to know that we will be accountable for the way the money is let out and spent by the banks. If the banks are not willing to at least tell us how they spent it, then they shouldn't get it. I don't see a problem with that.
I'm not talking about that aspect. I'm talking about the inability then of banks to pay out dividends in some cases, and the fact that retroactively it would cap CEO compensation. And there is a lot of talk on Wall Street, and we saw the bank stock sell off yesterday about the fact that some of the institutions that may legitimately need TARP help would exit the TARP, give the money back, and you would have vulnerable financial institutions outside of the TARP.
So this is a strange conversation. If there's a logic here that the banks need the money, then it's hard to believe that they can continue to pay excessive executive compensation if they're in need of taxpayer bailout money. At the same time, if they're in need of this money, how can they afford to pay out dividends, which means they've got extra money to pay out to shareholders on the shares that they own? They either need the money and therefore have to be frugal everywhere else, including executive compensation or dividends, or they don't need the money and they're free to go ahead and pay their executives what they wish and put out whatever amount of dividends they want to their shareholders. But you can't have it both ways. The American public demand accountability. The American public expects that their taxpayer dollars will be spent wisely. And so the banks have to either come forward and say we need it,
or you just go right time very quickly, please, if you could, on this issue of retroactivity, whether or not it ought to be retroactive to those who are retaking the money.
Well, and it shows specifically that things were not put in place at the front end of this. The accountabilities were not there, and indeed the banks that got the money did not use it for liquidity and did not use it to address the credit issues that Main Street America is facing. And the American people have had their fill of this, and they do want to see some transparency. They do want to see some accountability. You know, it's going to be tough to do it retroactive, but I certainly wish we could go back and do a lot of this over, because, and that's why I voted no the first time around.
Well, at least we got you agreeing on a couple points. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.